In southeastern Nigeria, during the height of the British colonial rule, a storm was quietly gathering, a storm not led by men in battle, but a group of extraordinary women who would rise to challenge one of the mightiest empires the world had ever known. These women would go on to become icons in both Nigeria and global history. What began as an uprising of local market women in southeastern Nigeria later became known as the Aba Women's Riots of 1929. The roots of the Aba Women's Riots can be traced back to the early 20th century, to a time when British colonial rule was beginning to take hold over all of Nigeria. On January the 1st of 1914, Lord Frederick Lugard, the first British colonial governor of Nigeria, introduced a system known as indirect rule. This rule was a revolutionary system for the British. Instead of governing directly, they would use local leaders to manage the day-to-day affairs of the people. The idea was simple. The British would appoint local men, often called warrant chiefs, to oversee the communities, acting as intermediaries between the British colonial government and the indigenous populations. In theory, it was meant to be efficient, but in practice, it was deeply flawed. For centuries, the Igbo people had governed themselves through a system of elected leaders chosen by the community. Women had powerful roles in this system, particularly in the markets, where they played a central part in local economies, but the appointed warrant chiefs were not chosen by the people, and over time they grew increasingly oppressive. These warrant chiefs began seizing land, imposing unjust taxes, and enforcing harsh local laws. They became despotic figures, using their newfound power to control the population. The Igbo people, particularly the women, saw their autonomy slipping away. Among the most powerful figures in Igbo society were the market women. They were the lifeblood of the local economy, responsible for feeding the growing urban populations in cities like Calabar, Owerri, and Aba. They were fierce, resilient, and proud, yet vulnerable to the whims of both the colonial administration and the newly appointed warrant chiefs. And then, in 1928, the British colonial government announced plans to impose a special tax on these market women, threatening their livelihoods, their independence, and their very survival. The year 1929 marked a turning point. The announcement of the tax sent shockwaves through the markets. For Igbo women, this wasn't just about money. It was about survival, about their role in the society, about the very foundation of their community. It was the final straw in a long history of oppression under colonial rule. But the women did not rise up with weapons in hand. They turned to their traditional power, their voices, their music, and their ability to unify. In towns like Aba, Calabar, and Owerri, women began organizing. They drew on their traditional method of protests, particularly a custom where women would gather together, singing, chanting, and using ridicule to shame men, especially those in power. It was a ritual of defiance, a way to publicly challenge authority. The women used their song and dance not just to mock the authorities, but also to assert their own power. Soon, the protests escalated. Women gathered in their thousands, converging on the native administration centers in major towns. In Aba, they surrounded the colonial offices, demanding that the warrant chiefs be removed, that the taxes be abolished, and that the colonial government respect their rights. In many towns, they succeeded in forcing warrant chiefs to resign, though the colonial government was far from ready to back down. The protests spread like wildfire. The women attacked not only the warrant chiefs, but also the institution of colonial power itself. They stormed European-owned stores, breaking windows and looting goods. They targeted Barclays Bank, a symbol of British economic dominance in Nigeria, and raided native courts, burning them to the ground. The British colonial authorities, fearing that the protests were spiraling out of control, sent in troops and police to restore order. The response was swift, brutal, and violent. Colonial soldiers opened fire on unarmed women, killing at least 50 and wounding many more. But despite the violence, the protests continued for 2 months. As many as 25,000 Igbo women participated in this uprising, challenging both the local chiefs and the colonial authorities. The legacy of the Aba Women's Riot of 1929 cannot be overstated. Though the immediate result was the suppression of the protests, the women had achieved something far more significant. They had forced the British colonial government to abandon its plans to tax the market women. More importantly, the uprising led to significant reduction in the power of the warrant chiefs. The Aba Women's Riot, as it came to be known, was a defining moment in the struggle against colonialism in Nigeria. It was the first major direct challenge to British authority in Nigeria and more broadly in West Africa. The women of the Aba's riots not only fought for their own rights, but also set a precedent for future anti-colonial movements across the continent. Today, their courage is seen not just as an act of resistance against colonial powers, but as a powerful feminist movement, a testament to the strength of women standing together for justice. The memory of the women who led the Aba's riots lives on. Their fight for justice, for autonomy, and for equality paved the way for future generations. It is a fight that continues today as women in Nigeria and beyond challenge oppressive system and demand their rightful place in society. The Aba Women's Riot was not just an event in the past. It was the spark that ignited a fire, and its flames continues to burn brightly. The struggle for equality, for independence, and for justice continues, but it is rooted in the courage and determination of the women who rose in 1929 to challenge the might of an empire. This is the story of Aba Women's Riot, the story of ordinary women who became extraordinary heroes. Their fight was not just for their time, but for a lifetime. Thank you so much for watching this video on Frank Speaks. If you found this video compelling, do well to hit the notification bell, hit the like button, and as well drop a comment on what you think about the uprising of women in Aba and as well as different parts of the country during the colonial rule in Nigeria. Do well to also check out some other videos existing on this channel. Once again, thank you so much for watching.